Right. So the last macromolecule is nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are DNA and RNA, the things that make up your genetic code. Um, so there's really two roles, as I said, of nucleic acids, and there's two main types. There's deoxyribonucleic acid, which is DNA, and then there's ribonucleic acid, which is RNA. And they both have their different roles. We're going to get in a lot more into nucleic acids when we get into genetics, because literally that whole part of the course is just about DNA and RNA and how it interacts. But I do want you to know now the structure of amino acids, or nucleic acids, and how do you identify them? So nucleic acids are just polymers of things called nucleotides. That's the monomer that makes up nucleic acids. And they can attach to other nucleotides via dehydration synthesis, just like all of the other monomers do. A nucleotide has this basic structure. It has a sugar, a phosphate, and a base. Okay? So how can we tell the difference between the two? It has a sugar phosphate base, sugar, see the pentagon, phosphate group with a P, and a base. It's called a nitrogenous base. That's the ATGC part, if you remember back from freshman year. A pairs with T, G pairs with C. We'll get into that later. But the other way you can tell is through, it has CHOMP, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, just like proteins, but this has phosphorus, but it always has phosphorus. Proteins will never have phosphorus, and that's due to the phosphate group that's attached right here. Okay, and I shouldn't say the proteins will never have phosphorus, but in terms of what you guys have to know, they would not have phosphorus. So this is showing you the molecule ATP. ATP, which we use for energy, is actually a nucleotide. It's a nucleic acid. It has a sugar. It has 3 phosphates. That's why it's called triphosphate. And then it has a base, which is, in this case, adenosine, or adenine, which is related to it. Okay? Now, what's really cool about DNA, and proteins as well, is that we can actually use them to measure evolution. We've only briefly talked about evolution so far. We get into it more at the end of the year after we've talked about genetics in depth. But basically, the more similar DNA structures, or the DNA sequences in individuals, and protein sequences in individuals, the more closely related they are biologically. So we can actually look at evolutionary connections between different species by using measurements of similarity between DNA and proteins in organisms. Okay, that was it. Nucleic acids was super easy because we spent a whole bunch of time later in the year on it. So things you want to know: DNA and RNA. Remember that DNA has that double helix structure. RNA only will have one. Sometimes it's twisted on itself. The monomer of a nucleic acid is a nucleotide. We look for CHOMP, but always has phosphorus, never sulfur. Okay, its nucleotide is a sugar, phosphate, and base put together, the 3 parts. ATP is an example of it. It just has 3 phosphate groups. So if you see 3 phosphate groups next to it, you're probably looking at a nucleic acid because it's ATP. And the purpose of it is it is important for the storage of genetic information, the transfer of genetic information, and it is the instructions. So we're going to see this. It is actually the recipe book for making the proteins, which I said are the most important thing in biology, these machines that do all of the life processes. All right, that's nucleic acids. If you have any questions, let me know.